house.
Oh my god.
Can you tell me about it? It's a house.
I'm tired. You woke me up at 7:30.
Oh, that's so early. We're back, Church Without Walls, and I'm excited about this, actually. We're going to get a chance to talk about Jesus. We were on a little bit earlier talking about grief, and I'm giving Peyton some grief for her art project. Not the project itself. It was delightful. It's just her explanation lacked enthusiasm. That echoes in here. The cat's pajamas is an expression that some people use to explain that something that is better than sliced bread. It's something truly phenomenal and amazing. Unfortunately, in modern apologetics, since the Enlightenment, I think, we've gotten caught up in overselling Christianity as kind of an elixir that gets every stain out. You know, something that is going to help you build a business, have the best marriage, straighten your teeth, grow your hair, kind of a prosperity, like rose-colored glasses kind of thing. And recently, I want to use a clip from one of my favorite shows, Justin Brierley's Unbelievable, where he usually has on an atheist and a Christian to talk about things and see where they agree and where they don't on certain topics. And on this particular episode, as you see here, he had Glenn Scrivener, who's just written a book about how Christianity makes the world more moral. That's not what it's called, but that was the topic of Unbelievable. And the opposing view, or the view that was going to critique that view, was by the historian Bart Ehrman, who's maybe the world's most famous former Christian, who happens to be, he calls himself a Christian atheist, actually, or an agnostic. But he's not the typical atheist in that he finds Jesus Christ to be the most important figure of all time and fascinating and so forth. So I like to hear from Dr. Ehrman. But I'm going to show you a clip here, and I want to walk you through it. But basically, the gist of the book, and I've called it basically a rehash of D. James Kennedy's book, What If Jesus Had Never Been Born, which I think actually is a better book because he focused on the impact of the revolutionary Jesus and what came into the world as a result of Jesus. But Glenn's book basically argues that even modern feminism, even something as the modern feminist movement, is thanks to Christianity. Modern science, thanks to Christianity. And you know, he goes through this different chapter by chapter on how all this, everything that's basically good in modern times is because of Christianity. Now, this isn't hard to pick apart. And for the 2-hour debate or conversation, frankly, Bart Ehrman made a monkey out of Glenn Scrivener. It was embarrassing how bad it was. But I want to show you this 10 minutes to kind of demonstrate why Christian apologists shouldn't argue for this, and how we've missed the point in presenting Jesus. I mean, we're not in the. I mean, I think some people have taken apologetics to mean that we have to defend the church. And the church is indefensible in ways. You know, there's many things that are ugly about the church, from its treatment of people to political hierarchy to scandal to trauma. And there's many people who present Christianity as a brand, and Christ has very little to do with it. But Christianity presented as a brand means greater civilization, greater peace, greater prosperity, no wars. Basically, everything you read in Leviticus 26, if the Jews would have followed God's precepts. So, without further ado, I want to jump right into it. And this is literally like the last 10 minutes of the interview. And Bart Ehrman has just commented on how the scientific revolution, yes, there were Christians, there were scientists who happened to be Christians because that was the world then, but they didn't use their Christianity to produce good science. They bracketed it and So it wasn't because of their Christianity that Newton or the others came up with what they came up with. And of course, they have a difference here, but we're going to take up at that place. So here's it.
That's why my Enlightenment chapter, which is all about the Middle Ages, is followed by my Science chapter, in which the scientific revolution is really an evolution from those Christian presuppositions.
Oh boy,
so people can read the book.
Look, I'll tell you what. No, that is. I don't know how much you've read about the philosophy of science, but I can tell you that is not. It is not Isaac Newton. If you just look, there are biographies of Isaac Newton. You just read him and tell me how much his Christianity was affecting his law of gravity. The whole point is he bracketed.
He wrote more Bible study than he did physics.
He absolutely did. He's a Bible. He loved the Bible, and he studied as much as he studied science. But when he did the science, which brought about the science revolution, he explicitly says in the Principia that he brackets any of his religious and philosophical assumptions because they don't help you do the science. He says that.
Oh, they totally. Yes, well,
he says it.
Well, then why does it come in Christian civilization from Christian universities by Christians explicitly talking about their Christian presuppositions?
They don't. The scientists don't. You don't have scientists talking about the Christian presuppositions who are real.
Oh, you do. You get Newton talking about it, and you can read quotes in my book. It's called The Air We Breathe.
But it's okay. Look, if we want to do competing bibliography, Justin, I'm happy to send some bibliographies for people who really want to know about it because I'm telling you, it's precisely because the Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton, these early 17th century, they bracketed the religious views in order to do the science, and that's what led to it.
Just as we come to the...
I just want to take that portion up for a moment, and let's talk about that, because it's a lazy, historically thing to do, to claim that Christianity birthed modern science, merely because the leaders of modern science in the different fields identified as Christians. It was a Christian world that happened in, but there were other forces that were moving there. You could say the same thing if you go into the Art Institute of Chicago and you walk through and you see some of the grand masters and their work. You could say, well, Christianity inspired, Da Vinci and Michelangelo, and look at how the inspiration for these early masters was the Bible. Well, that's the world they grew up in, and not just the church had great influence, but the church in many cases was the state back then. So if I find very few people today arguing that Christianity created modern art. It had a steward relationship to modern art in that it held the purse strings. And so, yes, Christianity was a great influence on science early on because it held the purse strings and the power and so forth. But when people hear this today, that if it wasn't for Christianity, we wouldn't have Newton and Einstein and such a great, and the iPhone, it seems to them that it's a little bit an oversell and almost absurd, because they've seen detractors of modern science and those promoting pseudoscience also coming out of the Christian world. I mean, the flat Earth movement is 2/3 of the flat Earth movement are fundamentalist Christians. That's not something we want to boast about, and somebody like Glenn Scrivener would just push that to the side. But ever since Galileo, really, the church has struggled with modern science. The church fought against heliocentricity, and it's taken a couple hundred years for us to catch up with the rest of the world. And now they are currently in a struggle against evolution and Darwin, and they still haven't caught up in many corners of the Christian tent. And so you see Christians are the ones who are arguing against vaccines, against masks. And so the people who look at this and they say, oh yeah, Christianity birthed all this. Well, yeah, you have to point back. You could point back and say Newton was a Christian, but yeah, so was that what led him on his quest? And I think it becomes a distraction, because you have a historian like Bart Ehrman pointing out the holes in the argument. Did Christ come to bring modern science? Did he come to birth modern feminism? Why are we taking credit for that? You know, at one point in the conversation, Glenn argues that monogamy was Jesus' thing. Monogamy existed before Jesus. Now, you can make an argument that Christian marriage has had positive effects, especially on child rearing. There's history there. But to make it something more than that, then people can point out how Christianity has led to a great deal of abuse in regard to marriage, and particularly in regard to divorce and so forth, and almost keeping women in relationships that were abusive a lot longer than they would have been. So here's the point. Now the argument, because this is the close of the debate, 2-hour debate, changes now. And Justin asks a very riveting question, and you might be shocked about the answer you're about to receive. Not from Glenn, that's typical, but from Bart Ehrman. And I share this because I think this is where we've missed out on the apologetics of the story. And unfortunately, sometimes atheists and even agnostics get it better than so-called followers of Christ. So let's jump back in now and allow Justin to ask this question of the two.
The end of the show, and I appreciate you've had lots of differences in some respects for some of Glenn's stuff, some agreement as well, especially on that piece on compassion. But I think overall, you don't have any problem with the idea that the Christian revolution, the triumph of Christianity, has had a huge cultural and moral impact, obviously, across the Western world. That goes probably without saying. The details, obviously, can be debated. But given that, you know, if you were to kind of accept that to some degree our modern conceptions of equality, compassion, and progress and so on do go back to this Christian story, is there anything in that, Bart, that tells you that should be taken seriously then as a story? You know, because I'm wondering, kind of, does this actually suggest in any way that Christianity itself is true, if it has been the vehicle by which we have received some truly true kind of views of what it means to be human and to be compassionate and everything else?
Quiet.
It's time for church.
There are no churches in this town.
It's
You're
typical
lying.
that they go to ads here, so I'm going to skip
So
this
my
ad.
view, this is
Forgive the YouTube ad. So here comes Bart's answer.
actually the topic of my next book, is on the contribution that Christianity made to culture, especially the compassion, dealing especially with charity and the distribution of wealth. So it depends what you mean by is Christianity true. I'm not a Christian. I'm an atheist, but I try to follow the principles that I see as the guiding principles of the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus about issues of helping others, dealing with those who are in need. Jesus does get this, of course, from Judaism, and so I don't think, but in our culture, people get it from Jesus. And so I think that part of Christianity is true. I think that in the sense that it's a true way of living. It's what it really means to be human, more than the ideology that most people have, which continues to be an ideology of dominance. People want to control others. This works on the international level, as we're seeing right now, internationally. It works within national politics. It works within families. It works that, you're supposed to control others. And Jesus had a very different paradigm. That it's a life of service, and if you've got means, you should help those who don't. And I completely agree with that. And I think it's a major revolution in understanding our civilization.
Glenn, any thoughts on the way you connect what you believe obviously is the extraordinary moral kind of...
So this is an amazing admission that you would normally not get from somebody who's considered an atheist. Normally, you get the two extremes, the hostile atheist, or forgive me, the Christian apologist, and those extremes basically argue that the hostile atheist, like, for instance, Christopher Hitchens or one of the Four Horsemen or Richard Dawkins, would suggest that religion doesn't offer anything that's good, right? Everything is bad. And, if Christ existed, he's all legend, and even he said horrible things. In other words, they don't give any ground at all. And then you have the modern apologists like Scrivener who basically say Christianity has led to everything from, like your iPhone to, the democratic process, capitalism and modern medicine and what we're missing is this balanced admission from this honest skeptic. And there are others too that are not Christians that admit that Jesus Christ was the perennial figure of all time, that Jesus Christ earned the change of the calendar because he comes into a world that is dark and chaotic, and he comes into a religion that is distracted by nationalism and that isn't caring for the outcast or the poor or the weak, the widow or the orphan, or the moral reprobate. And Jesus comes into all of that, and he is the stick in the wheel of both the religious world and the political world of his time. And he turns the world upside down. Jesus, with his words, turns the world upside down. He was that revolutionary. And there are some people in the faith who recognize that, but it's amazing when it's somebody outside the faith who will give Jesus his due. And in this conversation, the testimony of Bart Ehrman, who doesn't believe the resurrection happened, and yet he still says following Jesus is something he's interested in. Following his words and his argument about the care for the poor and so forth are more influential to him than anything else. And so I will share Glenn's comments here just to get to Bart's second statement. So we'll come up with that right now. I'll allow you to hear what Glenn says because he says some good things.
Force that Christianity brought into the world, and whether that actually ties back to a man called Jesus rising from the dead ultimately.
I think it goes back to the idea of what is the supernatural. So in my chapter on compassion, I talk about Macrina, the great saint who toured the rubbish dumps to collect children and raise them in her community, and the question is, what was she looking for on the garbage dump? And the deepest answer is she was looking for God on a garbage dump, because her vision of God was that God is the kind of God who descends to the garbage dump. I mean, typically crucifixion sort of happened outside the city in the place where you dumped all your refuse. And the God that Macrina believed in was a gutter level God who actually says in Matthew chapter 25, whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me. Such that what is she discovering as she pours herself out for the least and the last and the lost is the way of Jesus, but also somehow she's encountering Jesus in those who Nietzsche would describe as the weak, the low, and the botched. And I think people are very close to faith when they recognize the glory of service, when they recognize the absolute wonder of being poured out for the other. Because I think that is the supreme Christian vision of who God is. The fact that the cross is the most recognizable Christian symbol is because we believe you keep looking there and you keep looking until you say, whatever else God is or whatever else the ultimate is, that's the ultimate. And I would say to Bart, and I would say to many people, to get in touch with that is to be very, very close to what Christians mean by faith.
Hey, so check it out. This is a...
And they're throwing in another video here, which I'll skip.
Emergency sleeping bag. These things normally cost $30, and during the wintertime, people pay full price for them.
But before we move on, I just want to comment on what Glenn says here. He points out to those listening that he goes back to the crucifixion, that the resurrection is the pinnacle. And yet his whole book isn't about the resurrection being the pinnacle. It's about how Jesus has changed the world in ways that Jesus doesn't claim to change the world, in ways he actually claims to not change the world. When he stands in front of Pilate, he says, "My kingdom is not of this world." And modern apologists keep trying to make Jesus eat those words. They keep trying to make this world his kingdom. And they fight for this world as his kingdom. And Jesus has said, "I didn't come for that. My kingdom is not political power or social influence." And so you're either going to take Jesus at his word, or you're going to take his followers in modern apologetics as his word. But this is very different from the apologetics that brought C.S. Lewis out of his atheism. Dyson was an Anglican, Tolkien was a Catholic, but they talked to Lewis about the myth that was true. Tolkien used the expression Christianity, and what he meant by Christianity isn't what Glenn Scrivener means. He didn't mean, the cat's pajamas. He didn't mean, we live in a better world now because of Christianity. We have running water and electricity because of Christianity. He meant that a God that loved his people so much that he stepped down, became them, and died in their place. That's the story that every man wants to believe is true. And this is the story he presented to Lewis. The story, not the cosmological argument, not the argument from fine-tuning that modern apologists are so taken up with because of the Enlightenment. We have to prove it scientifically or mathematically as a certainty, and we get away from the person of Jesus. We get away from the words and the works of Jesus to prove that Christianity is a better detergent, that it could get your whites whiter and your colors brighter. This is not something that the apostles went around speaking about Jesus. They didn't say you'll have it better, under Roman oppression if you accept Jesus. They didn't say that. They didn't tell you you'll have a better marriage. Paul probably lost his marriage because of his relationship to Christ. If you read what happened to the early church, no, they didn't have prosperity and political freedom and blessing and the kind of thing that modern apologetics tries to brand Christianity as. But Tolkien tells Lewis, this is the story that every man wants to believe is true. This is the story that Ernest Hemingway tells when he tells of the story of the prodigal son, I think it was in Cuba, who disappeared, and his father takes out an ad in the newspaper saying, meet me out in front of the bank on Tuesday morning, Paco, all is forgiven. And outside of that bank on that Tuesday morning, I know I'm getting the specifics wrong, but there was like 200 different boys named Paco hoping that their father had forgiven and wanted restoration. That's the yearning that Hemingway is speaking to. That's the yearning that actually spoke to C.S. Lewis. The love of a God who becomes man and dies for him. That's the story every man wants to believe is true. Not some moral code that's anti-homosexual or that one man, one woman marriage or that supports the Second Amendment or votes for Donald Trump. None of that is the Christian gospel. We've added all of this stuff. Not that the earth is 6,000 years old and was created in 7 days and there was a global flood where God kills everybody except for one family, Noah, and who bunked with T-Rex on the ark. None of this nonsense is the gospel. And in spite of all of that, Jesus is still a relevant figure. So I want to close here with what Bart says next, because it's not enough that what he already said. This is what he says next, and I think it's a much better testimony than what the Christian apologist shared. but I'll let you decide.
Yeah, I think that I mean I don't treat it as as an actual reality that that Christ died for sins and was raised from the dead. I don't think that that's historically or is what really happened, but I do think that that story is for me is the most powerful story that's ever been told, and it's I don't think it's one that any of us really emulate. I don't know anybody who actually does what Jesus tells them to. I mean, but it is something that should really impact our lives and affect how we live. I agree with that, absolutely.
Fascinating. Final thoughts, Glenn, and we'll.
That to me is the best testimony of the whole show, and it was given by the atheist. Now, Bart says he never met anyone who actually lived as Jesus said, and I would agree with him. I said in the past that I've only really met one true Christian, jokingly, and half jokingly, because Bart Ehrman never met my mother. But she might be the closest that I've seen to somebody living like Jesus, with that kind of an attitude. And yet I can't consider myself in that vein. I think the ideal that Jesus put forward. And so to me, I am thrilled that a professing agnostic like Bart Ehrman says Jesus is an impactful figure that he tries to follow, that the story of Jesus, even though he doesn't believe it was historically true, he doesn't believe in a historical resurrection, but that story is the most powerful story ever told. To me, that should be the message that we're sharing as Christians. And I'm sorry, but to me, that is what the baptizer argued when he said, I must get smaller and he must grow. He put the spotlight on Jesus, not on Judaism or the Essenes or whatever you think John the Baptizer was, but I must get smaller and he must get larger. I see Christian apologists wanting to make Christianity the Messiah. They want Christianity to be larger than what it has earned, including all the baggage that comes with Christianity, which is basically church history. And the history we're making now in the scandals in the Catholic Church priesthood and in the mega churches that are caught up in money, power, and sex scandals. No, I'm willing to throw all that aside and say, just look at Jesus, right? As the wag quipped, to view true Christianity, one must nearly ignore all Christians. I'm for that. I'm for just saying, but what do you think about Jesus? But look at what he said and look at what he did. And you could be anti-religious and still love Jesus. Jesus is a Zorro figure. He is a Robin Hood figure, in that he came unto his own, and not only would his own have him not, but he tore down the presuppositions of his own and said, this is what's holding you back. This is what's killing you. It's not the Romans who are oppressing you. It's your view of your own holy book. It's your view of your own relationship to God that has made you pompous and zealous for vanity. So I am amazed that this honest skeptic was able to tip his hat not only to Jesus but to the story. And to me, that's the story. So, do what you want with Glenn Scrivener's book. I'm not telling you not to get it. But I am saying that modern apologetics has completely gotten it wrong. And we need to at least go back to C.S. Lewis and realize that the gospel is a story. Now, you might take it as legend or history, but it's a story that's transformative. It's a story that we all want to hear, like Paco wanted to see his dad's comment in the paper. We all have that yearning, and Christianity isn't offering an answer to that yearning anymore. It's offering secondary considerations that are not only not divine, but they're distractions. They're absolute distractions. So, I hope you've enjoyed that. I've got nothing left. I'm going to come to Poe here. What do you got, Poe?
It's a pot I made out of paper, and there's lots of green, different colors of green, and it's very full, and it's...
Actually, that's pretty cool. Is that for one of your doll houses?
Not really.
Not really? Let's go to this one and hold it up. Where?
And it can stand up. It has a little stand on the bottom.
It has a little stand.
Yeah, so it can stand
But this
up.
could be outside of one of your doll houses, actually. That's pretty
Yeah.
cool. All right. Folks, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week. God bless.